Good morning to everybody. I hope that everybody who's registered to attend this event is now online. My name's Simon Lloyd, and I'm here to welcome you all, both on behalf of the Royal Forestry Society, which is hosting today's event, and also on behalf of the Forestry and Climate Change Working Group, which is the supporter of this event. Forest soils cultivation is a very topical topic. I think that we're all trying to get more trees in the ground to meet afforestation aspirations, but we all want to do it right, not only for the reputation of our sector, but also to create a legacy that we can all be proud of. And so it's very important that our woodland creation plans evidence our knowledge and skill on forest soils and how to manage them, as that's a absolutely critical part of the forest creation plan. And so we're very pleased today that Jens Haufe from the Forestry Commission, who's deeply knowledgeable in this area, is here to walk us through a lot of information on forest soils and forest cultivation and forest soils cultivation. So I hope that you enjoy and get a lot of benefit from this session. And with that, I'm going to hand you over and put you in the very safe hands of Chris Sorensen, who's chairing this session. He's a Woodland Resilience Officer for the Forestry Commission, and Jens Haufe, and hope that you have a good event. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you to the RFS for hosting this event, as well as part of the Forestry and Climate Change Working Group. We're very, very grateful for your help. Welcome everyone to what will be a really great technical learning session. Just a very quick and brief intro from me as to why the FC in England commissioned Jens to provide this training. Over the last few years, we've been given back our license to plant new forests, and that's for two very urgent reasons. First, the catastrophic decline in biodiversity, which would indicate we need new native woodlands, but also the climate change emergency around which a desire for carbon sequestration has been created. And that means any woodlands, native or exotic. But these woodlands must be created to the UKFS, and with particular reference to these three sections. When it comes to soils, there are plenty of people who don't agree with planting trees, particularly exotics. There are even people out there who don't seem to want native woodland. So there will be people out there looking for us to fail. Let's not lose our license to plant. Right, very quick bit of housekeeping. Webinar's been really, really popular, phenomenally popular, really. Hence why we've added a second event on the 3rd of February. This one's fully booked with 200 people booked on. Downside to that is that it means not everyone may get their questions answered. I apologize right at the start about that. But please put your questions in the chat function. I will do my best to either answer in the chat function where I can, or when Jens has a question break, I'll relay them to him in the best way I can, you know, amalgamating questions if they're of a similar nature, that kind of thing. We'll send out a very short questionnaire in the next day or two and include our draft policy guidance, which is for England only, which builds on this webinar. That's pending a full UKFS practice guide to be produced at some point. Okay, without further ado, let's get into soils. I'll pass over to Jens.
Right, good morning, everyone. I hope your screens have just turned purple, which means that you're seeing my presentation. Before I launch into it, I think I'd better say a few words about myself. I took my forestry education in Germany. That was, 40 years ago. I came to the UK 20 years ago and have been working in the forestry sector ever since. First at Bangor University as a researcher, then in Forestry Commission as a trainer, mostly on soils and other silvicultural topics. And lately I switched to forest research, and somehow the training function or my training role has followed me. So much as an introduction, and I think we go straight into today's presentation. What I'm going to show you is a bit of an introduction in terms of historic, how came that we ended up in a situation where we are now with kinds of cultivation issues. So moving on to UKFS requirements, the general requirement to cultivate soil, and considering site conditions. So that looks like quite a lot, but that is already half of the presentation. So after the soil site conditions, we will have a bit of a break and a first chance to ask questions. And the latter part of the presentation will then cover cultivation techniques and the decision-making process with another question and answer session at the end. So starting getting the ball rolling with a slide which I quite liked. It's not mine, but someone has summarized the development of productive forestry in the UK as follows: that in the early years, so starting around about 100 years ago, forestry was clearly given the remit to be productive, yet the planting principles of planting was carried out according to Anderson's principles. So site quality determined the species selection. That was all the easier then, because in those days we had a lot less technology, so we had to walk the sites more, and that led to a much better understanding of the site conditions and consequently to a more adaptive tree species choice. After the Second World War, that changed. Technology increasingly allowed us to make sites suitable to whatever we wanted to plant. In upland situations, mostly Sitka spruce. So this is where we talk about the era of big plows, deliberate fertilizer regimes, where we said, yeah, whatever the site, we can make it suitable for Sitka spruce. And we still created very productive, but more industrial style forests, even-aged monocultures, the typical plantation forestry, which are still the bulk of our legacy. And that is it does become a bit of an issue because the goalpost, the context has changed. We are driven towards more sustainability. And when I say more sustainability, what I mean is sustainability in more than just productive function of the forest. It's sustainability of use of land resources, soil, water. We're also driven more towards multi-purpose forestry. So production is important, but it's by no means the only one. And we conflict a bit of that because a lot of our technical knowledge and a lot of our attitude within the forestry sector, I'm not saying we are backward-minded people, but we have not fully embraced that, how things have changed. And the principle of sustainable resource management, that is still something we have to work on. And the situation is made worse because we have added challenges: climate change, the need for carbon sequestration, pests and diseases, structural operational challenges, which all make the situation a bit different from what it was like. Just to illustrate that picture of the glorious past, establishing forests on open highland areas. We have learned the lessons from that. We know these were successful. We created very productive forests, but we did that at a price. And we know planting trees on deep plowed ridges leads to asymmetric root growth, subsequent tree stability problems. The micro-relief makes future forest operations awkward, to say the very least. And with the onset of climate change, we also get ever more drier springs and drier summers, where we can question the need for having these elevated planting positions, because our trees are probably more likely to suffer from drought than from waterlogged soil these days. On top of that, we have the new considerations. So we need to worry about the release of carbon dioxide. We need to worry about the disturbance of soil as an ecosystem in itself. We need to worry about soil erosion, just to name a few. So what does that mean for our guidance on cultivation? So Bulletin 119, for those of you who know, that has been written 30 years ago, and that is still very much valid. Cultivation of soils for forestry, the content of that. And there's hardly anything that has changed when we say we've gained new scientific insight. But what has changed is the context of the situation. 30 years ago, when Bulletin 119 was published, the focus was really on fast stand establishment. So planting trees, walking away from that, having a last check 5 years later, possibly, assuring that we get grant money, and that was it. We didn't look much further than that. These days, the focus is on minimizing the environmental negative impacts. So what has changed is not so much the science or the message in the Cultivation of Soils for Forestry Bulletin, it is the goalposts which have been shifted. And that means traditional guidance needs to be reviewed critically, because what used to be the best possible method 30 years ago is these days maybe only the second best, and what was the second or third best possible alternative is now much more in the focus of attention because of the different environmental impact. So begs the question, how far have we moved? Picture on the left, again, 40 years old. Clearly that is a practice of the past. We may still have been able to do that in the 1980s. Deep plowing on what clearly is a very peaty soil, we got away with that, but we won't these days. On the right-hand side, that's a picture I took only 7 years ago. And if you look at it, it's not as deep, but it is peaty soil that has been plowed, and at least the outcome for tree planting is very questionable. So you could actually rightly ask the question, well, how much of an improvement have we got achieved in the last 2 or 3 decades when we became very aware of climate change and the implications for forest operation. Looking at climate change, there is of course the need for us to get some basic facts right, and I hope I won't bore you, but just to go over a few figures. We have the greenhouse gases, which are the main contributors. The most important one by far is carbon dioxide. Methane is probably the next important one. And when we look at that, methane has 28 times the effect of carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. The next one on the list are nitrous oxides. They have 265 times the effects of carbon dioxide. So those three in the top line, they're the most important one from a forestry element, probably carbon dioxide and methane for cultivation, the really important ones. The other ones, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, sulfur hexafluorides, they're also greenhouse gases with a working mechanism which probably exceeds that of carbon dioxide, but they're not relevant for forestry. They can all be converted into carbon dioxide equivalents, and that is what we have to do in order to assess the impact of those gases. Even if we do that, it's still the carbon dioxide which is responsible for 86% of our greenhouse gas emissions. It may have changed a bit since 2014, but still the most important factor still is carbon dioxide. And forests offer a big chance there because forests accumulate carbon only up to a point. So if you think about the Amazonian rainforest, if it's undisturbed, that is carbon neutral. It's actually our productive forests where we harvest timber, which are carbon sinks. So there is quite a potential for forests to store carbon. 1 hectare, about 15 tons of carbon dioxide per year. That figure, obviously, it varies a lot. It will be very different for a yield class 24 Sitka than a native oak forest, but it also changes over time. So if an established forest, an old forest, will always store more carbon than a younger one. So the overall potential of carbon storage of UK forests is huge. We're looking at 3,800 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and actually almost 3/4 of that is stored in the soil. Only 28% in the biomass, but of course the good thing about the biomass is this is the proportion of carbon which we can regularly harvest, take away, and lock up for good, and then we increase more biomass. So this is an ongoing process. If you think about the carbon cycle in forests, I'm not going into any great detail about this diagram. It's all pretty self-explanatory that carbon is first picked up by trees, and then through litter and decaying wood, it gets actually stored in the soil. The timber, when it's being harvested, again, it depends how much of it is actually taken out of the forest, how much is converted into wood products, and it also matters what kind of wooden products. You can imagine the lock-up time of carbon is very different for pulp and paper than it is for fuel wood, construction timber, joinery grade timber. But that's not the topic of today. We are looking at specifically at cultivation, so harvested areas replanted, and even if we think afforestation sites, the same issue still arises. There is carbon locked in the soil, and we are trying to grow trees there. So carbon loss is quite obviously linked to soil, and this is a cutout of the UKFS guidelines, and if you scan the page for the term carbon loss, it appears 3 times, and it is quite clearly linked to disturbance of soil, to erosion of soil, and to the disturbance of organic matter. So looking at soil, we will probably have to start with the question, well, what is actually soil made of? And this is where it turns a bit, well, I hope not into a training course, but I thought it might be useful to refresh our knowledge about what is in soil. Soil is only to 50% solid matter, the rest, or the other 50%, are gaseous and watery, and the 50% solid matter are mineral component, which is where all the vital nutrients and the not quite so important trace elements are sitting, and the organic component, which is the source of carbon. So straight away, when we think soil and carbon release, you can imagine the split by 55% mineral, 5% organic. That is a very average ballpark figure. That is not true for every single soil. So the straight conclusion we can take from that is, well, soil is not necessarily the same as soil. Just comparing the 2 pictures, it doesn't take a genius to work out which one has actually more carbon stored in it, and where therefore soil disturbance is a much more important issue with regard to carbon dioxide release. Now, the brown earth on the left-hand side, that will have some carbon in it, but nowhere nearly as much as the peaty clay on the right-hand side. So the first important statement I would like to make, when we think about cultivation of soil, we can't treat soil just as one entity. There are so many different kinds, and they all have a different composition with regard to carbon, but also with regard to other factors. So what is the right cultivation method on one type of soil can be the very wrong one on another one. What else is in soil? Other than carbon, we have to look at living organisms. And there could be quite a lot of that. So up to 25 tons per hectare contained in the topsoil. Technically, they all count towards the carbon content. So all the live little beasts, fungi, mycelium, bacteria, whatever is in soil accounts for the carbon content of soil. This is why, one of the reasons why even mineral soils, they have a fairly high carbon content, to some degree, a lot more than the trees which are growing on them. But this picture also shows that we need to consider the soil more and more as a working ecosystem in itself, which doesn't necessarily take kindly to disturbance. And we also need to be very clear that this is where forestry is very different, or has to be very different, from agriculture. Modern industrial style agriculture is very intensive, and without intensive and sometimes aggressive cultivation, without use of fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, it is not capable to produce the current output it does. Forestry, on the other hand, is extensive by nature, and it is long-term by nature. So forests are naturally working ecosystems, and forester is very different from a farmer in the way that we are only supposed to subtly nudge and steer natural processes rather than conquer and take ownership of the entire process and dictate what is going to happen, where and when. So it casts a bit of a different light on the approach, the philosophy required by us to manage forests. And I'm moving on to a slide here showing a secondary succession. And don't be distracted by that burning tree on the left. That is obviously would be a natural cause. Just imagine that is where it says fire, that is the clear fell of the old productive stand. If we walked away, this is most likely what would happen in most scenarios. We would get annual plants, grasses, perennials, shrubs, first pioneer trees, then intermediate species, then climax species. So trees have, or trees are the dominant elements of most of our climax communities. There are very few areas in England or in Britain which would not develop a woodland cover over time if we gave them enough time. So basically we are actually happy enough to live in a climatic region where forests or where the natural succession is very likely to lead to the establishment of forests. We have the right temperatures, we have most importantly enough rainfall. So the problem now which arises to us, we actually want to get from this fallow period, and we could say that is afforestation of ex-arable ground, we actually want to go to these intermediate species. And if we pick our beloved Sitka spruce, that quite clearly falls in that category. Now, if we look at the time scale here, it says it might take up to 150 years, and quite clearly, and obviously we are not prepared to wait that long, nor should we. But we should probably reflect a bit on the question whether trying to get productive Sitka spruce established within 2, 3, or even 5 years is the right thing to do. Of course, clearly we're trying to do something which is not in the natural master plan, which is not in the succession cycle. So we're trying to jump a couple of phases or stages, trying to speed up things. And I would probably argue that with cultivation and our philosophy for establishing, we may have gone a bit too far in that direction. We probably may have to step back and say, well, okay, we don't necessarily have to get the crop established after 5 years. If it takes 7 or 8 or maybe 10 years, that still is a good achievement if we actually can do it in a way that is far less or has far less negative impacts on the environment as a whole. There will still be reasons why we have to cultivate, but we should not look at cultivation as a default solution. And cultivation should be seen as a measure to really facilitate establishment of trees where it's absolutely necessary. And we do cultivate, by cultivation, we alter the soil conditions. And the four main reasons for cultivation, I've lined them up here. It's about weed competition, soil aeration is an important one, remineralizing humus, which boosts the nutrient level for the trees we put in the ground, and in some cases addressing compacted soil layers. There are other reasons why we cultivate, and sometimes the other reasons take a bit of the first and dominant role, but I think this is very wrong. These are really the ones which are important, where it is about plant survival and successful plant establishment. So I would ignore all the other reasons for the moment and say these are the ones why, when you say yes, we'll have to cultivate. And if we decide to cultivate, we should do that under certain guiding principles. The first one being is that whatever we do, it's only a temporary change of site conditions. So we have to work within the limitations of the site. If a site is waterlogged, it will be waterlogged. We have to accept that. We can't, and even if we could, we shouldn't try to dry it out. So the site dictates what is possible. Remember, forestry should be extensive. We cannot change our resources. We cannot exploit them at an unsustainable scale. So we have to live with what we've got. The next challenge is that a lot of our forest sites are actually quite variable. So we have many of them, and the bigger they are, the more likely this is. We will find a range of soil conditions, sometimes other site, even climatic site conditions, which means there is no one prescription which is right in all scenarios. Point 3 is that we need to weigh the benefits which we gain from cultivation, which are fairly short-lived. They're very clear. We have done enough research that we know, yes, the more we cultivate, the faster trees will grow. It's only recently that we actually are starting to look at the downsides, and the mid and long-term side effects may very well be negative. So far, we've brushed them under the carpet. I've recently conducted a research for Forestry and Land Scotland looking at the long-term effects of trench mounding. And whilst trench mounding was and still is hailed by some as the best possible option because it gives you fairly neat restock sites, and the trees obviously like it and the planters like it, the study has also found on 75% of those sites harvesting and logging is made difficult by the presence of trenches, but more so by the presence of mounds and high stumps. So we cannot afford to look at short-term benefits only. We need to look at the whole production process. And in forestry, that is a very long one. And the final point is really less is more. So I've made the point on the previous slide, trees regenerate natural after all. So we plant them, that's fine, but we don't need to take an approach which is similar to the one we take at farming. So trees, essentially, they look after themselves. And I'm not saying about neglecting the forest, we just have to be a bit more patient and accept that the less intensive techniques are the more sustainable ones long-term, even if they're not necessarily the fastest or the cheapest. A couple of pictures on drainage, because very often that is linked in with cultivation, and I think we need to be very clear in our view here as well. Drainage is without doubt necessary and beneficial, but as I said earlier, we should not try to dry out areas. Forests are water storage facilities. And we've had enough of climate extremes resulting in flash flooding and longer flooding. Forests are actually the best way of remediate these events. So the objective of drainage should really be to manage the water flow on a site rather than to drying the site out. And sometimes, and that is more what the picture on the right-hand side is about, we actually try to use cultivation to address micro drainage. Like here, where obviously a hillside has been plowed and the trees have been planted on a furrow. So it's a bit, yeah, you create a drain and next to the drain, you plant trees on a drier microsite. Well, if you really need to drain a site, then drain it. But this approach, you're using the wrong tool to address an issue which the tool hasn't been designed for. So quite apart from the fact that, yeah, they seem to have plowed a brown earth here, certainly a cultivated one, and you might ask why on earth was a raised planting position deemed necessary. And that leads us into the decision-making process. So far, it was really just to set the scene about what things should go, what processes, what considerations should go into our decision-making process. The first step, or the baseline for decision-making, obviously, it's the soil type. Cultivation addresses soil issues, so we have to be clear about what kind of soil are we dealing with, and linked with that, what is an appropriate tree species to plant on that soil. And while soil types are probably more or less aware of this matrix, soil groups or soil types, they can be quite easily squeezed into a matrix where we say we've got a soil nutrient regime, which tells us how fertile the soil is, and we've got a soil moisture regime, which tells us how wet the soil is. And all the groups and soil types, they fall in somewhere onto that grid. It's a very easy, very logical, slightly simplified way of looking at things, and it is still a good starting point. So my first comment to that would, yeah, whatever we think about cultivation, choosing a suitable, site-adapted tree species is the key to success. So whatever you do cultivation, if you pick the wrong tree species, you will always fight an uphill battle. If whatever you have chosen is not suited to site conditions, you'll never win, really. The other point, the other comment is really, as I already said, it's a bit simplistic, just looking at soil fertility and soil moisture. There are other characteristics. How much soil do we have? So rootable depth, texture, stoniness. So there are quite a few other side factors which I'll comment on later on. Right, identifying soil type. So what are we looking at here? The puddle on the bottom of the picture gives us a clue. We're looking at the clay. All soils, if we look at soil profiles, they have this A, B, C profile. A is the topsoil, B is the subsoil, C is the parent material. So that is often the bedrock, sometimes something else of which the soil or the mineral soil is made of. So this ABC pattern is valid for almost all soils we come across. Now, clay soils, they're characterized by the fact that both the topsoil and the subsoil are waterlogged. So that is what makes clay essentially, high water content and not quite as much air content as our diagram earlier on would suggest. Organic layer, which could be raw humus or peat on the top. It may be present, it may not be. If it is on a clay soil, it is less than 5 centimeters. That is the maximum permissible for a clay. If we cut out the water and look at something a bit more benign for tree growth, brown earth, we have again, the same ABC structure, only this time, both topsoil and subsoil are free draining. We can again have a bit of organic layer. In this case, it would be raw humus, but again, it's limited to a maximum of 5 centimeters. If you have more than 5 centimeters humus on top, then it is unlikely that it is a brown earth. So that is what characterizes a brown earth. Something that looks a bit more stripy, podzol soils. This is where things become a bit interesting. Starting on the top, we definitely on the podzol, we have quite a bit of raw humus or organic layer. It could be up to 45 centimeters. So podzols will always have that O layer on top. And then the ABC, it's spiced up a bit by the addition of an E layer, which is part of the topsoil. So our topsoil is, it may be a bit gray, but underneath it becomes very pale, bleached, as the technical term is, still freely draining, as is the subsoil. The subsoil is then rather orange and still freely draining. And I'm not turning this into a soils training course, but there could be an BH layer in between here where humus has accumulated, humus having been washed down from the top. You can see that quite nicely on the picture, but that may be present or absent, so it's optional. So podzols, what changes here, they're freely draining, but they have a lot more humus than brown earth. With iron pan soils, things change again. They evolve from podzols, but they are different as the BH layer is now replaced by an EF. And the F stands for ferric, and that is our iron pan. And the iron pan acts as a barrier which limits water percolation down the soil. So what we have in iron pan soils, we have a waterlogged topsoil sitting on top of a free draining subsoil. And at the very surface, we have, similar to podzols, organic layers up to 45%. So iron pan soils are a bit of a funny one. They count towards the freely draining soils, but actually they have a waterlogged topsoil. And it's that waterlogging that leads to the raw humus or likely peat accumulation on the top. Moving on to the properly waterlogged soils again, we now have a peaty clay, and unlike the ordinary clay, a peaty clay is one that has a peat layer on top, at least 5 centimeters and as much as 45. Other than that, they are like ordinary clays. Topsoil and subsoil are waterlogged. You just have almost, or you may have up to ½ meter of peat on top. Now, in order to assess the magnitude of, for example, carbon on soil, or to make an informed decision about what cultivation is appropriate on any kind of site, it is necessary to know a bit more about soil classification. And by I won't make it too specific and too detailed, but just to give you a bit of a taste about how we look at forest soils. Forest soil classification, some may know it as Forestry Commission soil classification. There is only one we have in the UK. And what it contains, we distinguish between 7 soil classes. There are the soils with the well aerated subsoils, in other words, the freely draining soils, the waterlogged soils, technically called poorly aerated subsoils, so they are the mineral soils. Then we have the organic soils, that's our peats, flushed or unflushed. So those 4 make the main soil classes. They probably account for over 90% of our forest soils. And on top of these, we have man-made soils, rankers, and skeletal soils, which are really shallow in nature. So we have less than 30 centimeters of soil available, and littoral soil, which are really just sands, gravel near the coast. So that's the minor soil classes. So that's our 7 classes. We can then subdivide into soil groups. So the freely draining soil, we have the brown earth, the pot soils, the iron pan soils, and the calcareous soils. The waterlogged soils have the groundwater glaze, the peaty glaze, and the surface water glaze. Flushed peatlands, we have two groups there. The unflushed peatlands has two groups there. And then three. And then we have the minor soil types. So all in all, we distinguish 15 different soil groups. And it's no good to complain about the odd numbering system. That's what it is. You don't necessarily need the numbering. You do need it if you read, if you have to interpret, if you're looking at a professional soil map, because this is where the numbering is used. It doesn't end here, I'm afraid. These soil groups are then divided into 50 soil types. I'm only giving you an example for the brown earth. So we have typical ones, basic ones, upland ones, and podzolic ones. And we can do similar subdivision for the other soil groups. So you can imagine somehow you need to break the 15 down into 50. So there is a bit of a hierarchy involved, but this is basically the level to which soils are mapped. And I'm afraid that is still not the end of it. In order to describe soils more accurately for the needs of forestry, including the need for cultivation, our soil system contains 14 soil phases, which can be allocated to mineral soils only. So the peats don't have phases, but the mineral soils, they can have up to 14 different phases, which describe them more accurately. Again, I'm only giving you a couple of examples. C, the suffix C stands for cultivated, and that is very relevant because that will apply to a lot of our afforestation sites. If they have been used by agriculture, then it is quite likely that they have been altered in their properties and their characteristics by agricultural use. May it be slurry that has been used to fertilize on arable soils, plowing obviously. So there's all kinds of things that may have happened there. So a cultivated soil, it's just given us a bit of an idea that, about the history of soil use and how it may have changed things. The other phase is peaty. Now, I've mentioned peaty glaze already, but we also have a peaty phase, which just reinforces the notion of a particular O horizon, so a raw humus or peat layer on top of the soil. Unfortunately, the definition, what makes it peaty, it varies. So it is not the same for all soil groups or all types. So podzolls and groundwater glaze, if they get a peaty phase attached to it, it means, yeah, you have between 5 and 45 centimeters for a peaty clay. If you call it a peaty clay with a peaty phase, it means you have at least 25 centimeters. And for an iron pan soil, if you call it a peaty iron pan, the peat layer is somewhere between 15 and 45. But it's there for a reason, and I'm not going to confuse anyone any further. We have actually quite good training courses for that. So it's not an end in itself. So this is where it all where it all ends. We need these acronyms and abbreviations to make meaningful soil maps. So this is an example of one, a cutout of an FC soil map. The water body up here, that's a Kielder water. For those who are interested, and a soil map, it shows these polygons and it just has the soil type and sometimes with a face in there. Now, the rules for that, the polygons need to be at least half a hectare in size. If you have any soil types which are smaller than that, they wouldn't be mapped. They would just show in square brackets, and that means that's a local occurrence. You can include peat depth in centimeters, and you can allocate up to 3 soil types to each polygon. You see that already. So there's a 9B, so obviously only one soil type here, or here's a 10B, but here's a 9B and a 6. So it's a deep peat and a peaty clay. Here's a peaty clay and a peaty clay with a peaty face. Here we have actually 3. So it's a bit of an iron pan, a bit of a peaty clay, and bits of rancor. So obviously very shallow soils. And again, in order to determine what it means for cultivation, we need to have an understanding of soil maps. And I'm quickly going to run through a few examples here. I'm using 4B, which is an intergrade iron pan, 6P, which is a peaty clay, 9D, which is a flush bog, it's a Molinia bog of some description. If your map only shows a 4B, it means that you have 85% at least of an iron pan there. That is the soil mapping conventions. So it means up to 15% of the soil could actually be unspecified. So your soil surveyor was confident to say, yeah, this is all the same, large enough area to be allocated an iron pan, but he or she may not have walked every little square meter, and there's only so many soil pits you can dig. So the assumption is, yeah, up to 15% could be something else, but we don't know what. So we've just given it a map entry of 1 soil type. If there's 2 soil types there, we have a primary and a secondary one. So it actually does matter which one is before the slash and which one is behind. The first one will have at least 50%. 50% to 3/4 of the site is 4B. 1/4 to 50% is now a peaty clay. And again, 15% may be something different. That is in the nature of the conventions. There's also the option that the second soil type is in brackets. If in that case, it changes the proportion. So your primary soil is now 75 to 85%, whereas the one in bracket is only 15 to 25%. Still with unspecified 15%, so 15% could be something else. If we really use 3 soil types in any one polygon, if they're just separated like that, it's an almost even split. The first and the second one are both 30 to 40%. The last one is a slightly lower proportion, so 20 to 40%. Importantly, there's no longer any unspecified proportion expected. The assumption is if the surveyor has actually gone to the made the effort to have 3 different soil types in one polygon, he or she has surveyed the area thoroughly enough to say, yeah, there's nothing else there that they haven't found. And then, of course, we can add brackets again. So this notation with the 9D in brackets, it boosts the proportion of the first soil type. The second one now becomes at least 1/4 up to 1/3, and the last one, the one in brackets, is actually slowed down. Whatever is in bracket is always 15 to 25% only. And you can have the second and the third one in brackets, which gives you a 50 to 70, 15 to 25, 15 to 25 split. Again, no unspecified area. So I don't want to take it at too academic a level, but this is basically, if you decide about how to cultivate a soil, we will be starting with a soil map. And in order to really know what expects you, what is likely to be there, you need to be able to interpret that map correctly. So this is kind of the level of significance and the level of confidence. There is, of course, yeah, there's always the bailout clause, but we don't need to worry about that. It's, there's never a guarantee. You only sample a soil when you survey a soil. Right. Once we are happy with the soil type, the next step is probably stepping back a moment and consider if cultivation is needed at all. Like showing here on this picture, it looks like a brown earth to me. So begs the question, why did people feel the need to have mounds on it and stick the trees onto little molehills? There is vegetation there, which is grass, which could have been addressed by other means. So, which may not have had to be addressed at all. It depends a bit on what tree species and how careful the trees are planted and what kind of other maintenance operations you're prepared to do. So basically, this is the drive towards less is more. So no cultivation if you can get away with it. And I know from my experience on the continent, most forest sites in Central Europe, there's no cultivation. Cultivation really is the exception rather than the rule. So flat planting, I think we have somehow lost our realistic view, and that flat planting could, and in many cases should be, a viable option. If we decide that we do need to cultivate, then we need to be clear about what cultivation should achieve on the site. So there's our soils again, and on the right-hand side, we have the main objectives for cultivation. And the soils, for determining the objective for cultivation, they can be grouped. Brown earth, you can lump them together. Iron pan soils, very different category, a lot less fertile, a much wider range in terms of moisture. Podzols, the least fertile of our soils, and moisture-wise, they're freely draining. So podzols are no worse than brown earth. Podzols are never waterlogged. The waterlogged soils, we've got the glaze, which come underneath the brown earth. Glaze, obviously, still quite a fertility range from poor to very rich. Some of them could even be carbonate. They will overlap with iron pan soils, which makes it particularly tricky because you have different issues to address. And on those hatched area, you obviously have to address both issues. Peaty glaze, usually sitting a notch below the normal glaze in terms of moisture. Deep peats, bottom of the moisture scale. Rankers and skeletal soils, well, rankers, they're not always very dry, but they're quite likely to be so. So in this simplified matrix, they appear there at the top left corner. So very poor, and very dry. So what do we need to do with them? Glaze soils, we said, moisture regime, moist to wet. So there are actually glaze which border on brown earth, where we could say, well, actually, this is not too bad. This is hardly waterlogged. They almost still look brown. And fertility-wise, quite a range. They could be poor, and a lot of the glaze used for forestry are likely to be on the poorer side, but they could also be very rich. For tree planting, it means waterlogging. That may affect the root growth. If it's too waterlogged, the tree roots may not like to grow in there. It will depend on the tree species. If the clay is fertile, then we also have a weed competition issue. If the clay is unfertile, not so much. More on the long-term view for tree growth and more importantly for tree stability. If we pick the wrong species on the waterlogged soil, we will always have shallow-rooted trees, and that means by definition unstable trees. So we will always have to worry about wind damage, wind hazard. So what should cultivation therefore try to achieve? Obviously improve the soil aeration. So waterlogging means too much water, not enough air. So if we can do something to address that, then good. But we should only do it where necessary. And the clue is really in the first one. If it's a waterlogged soil, we have to pick a tree species which can live with that conditions, rather than say, no, we need to drain the site, and then we can get away with growing something that doesn't like the wet conditions. And the same is true and even more important for the weed competition. Where necessary, if weeds are a problem, we need to address that. Whether we need to address it by cultivation or by different means is another question. But don't go and say by default, oh, clay soils we need to address the weed. It will depend on the specific site. Brown earth, in contrast, they are fertility-wise, they're just as wide-ranging as clay, so poor to very rich. Moisture-wise, they are definitely freely draining. So for tree establishment, on the fertile side, we may have a weed issue. That is could be an issue. And the weeds, even if we find dense grass, even if we say it's not so much of a competition to the trees, it may actually harbor forest pests. For example, voles may have to be addressed for that reason. Long term, there are no issues. On earth, there is nothing we need to worry about. That is the best we can get for forestry. So cultivation really needs to address the weed issue, and it only needs to address that where it's necessary. So if it's a poor brown earth where we say, well, there will be a little bit of grass and we can actually address that by other reasons or by other measures, and or it isn't much of an issue for tree growth, then we can flat plant. Podzol's freely draining, but very poor to poor, and the focus is on very poor. So podzol's are the worst we usually get. Tree establishment, podzol's are also quite sandy, so podzol's are likely to be droughty, so desiccation. Waterlogging, never an issue, desiccation quite likely. And vegetation, it's not an issue because of it competes with trees. It is just an obstacle to the planters. On podzol's, we often have heathery vegetation, which simply makes planting very difficult. So we may have to address the heather vegetation, but not as a competition for trees, just to get it out of the way. Long-term issues, it's really just a yield class one. The low fertility dictates we will never be at the top end of the yield class range. So what we can do in terms to alleviate things for trees, and mostly it is mixing the organic with the mineral soil. So podzol's are poor. A lot of the nutrients picked up by the predecessor stand will be in the raw humus. And the moment we remove the tree cover, the raw humus is likely to dry out and the nutrients are likely to leach away. So we can kind of preserve that if we mix them with the mineral soil where they are maintained for longer. It also slows down carbon release, and hopefully the next crop can actually tap more into these resources. And as I already hinted, we may have to sort out the heather as an obstacle to planters. Iron pan soils, still on the very poor to poor side, fresh to moist, tree establishment issue. The main problem is the waterlogged topsoil. So the paler, the wet area here, trees may not like that, whereas the roots might be all right down here in the subsoil because that is freely draining. Heather vegetation, same as I said for podzol, that often applies to iron pan soils too. The long-term issue for trees is actually the iron pan. On really heavy iron pans, the BF horizon can pose an important issue, an obstacle for root growth. So we may actually end up with shallow rooting because the tree roots simply are not able to penetrate the pan. There is quite a range of iron pans, so there are benign ones where just the water is slowed down a bit and the roots can get through without problem, but there are also iron pans where we're actually talking about a 2 to 3 millimeter rusty sheet in the soil, which tree roots can't get through. And these one, obviously, this is where the long-term issue is much more present. So cultivation should aim to improve the drainage by breaking the pan. On top of that, mixing organic soil with mineral soil, it's the same with the nutrient recycling as in podzolls, and the heather, that again is the same as in podzolls. And just to illustrate this a bit, iron pan soils, obviously trench mounding won't help. If we hinge mount a soil, we kind of create a drainage plug here, but we still don't address the pan sitting underneath the planting position. So the best solution for an iron pan really is what we call inverted mounding, where you say this is, you break the pan, you allow the water to drain away locally, and it then doesn't matter how tall your mound is. If you plant the tree on that place, the place you have drained, then the tree roots can follow. On peaty glaze, the issue we have is the sudden change in nutrient content and texture. So peat is often relatively fertile and it's easily penetrable by roots. Mineral soil can actually be quite tricky. And on top of that, we have the waterlogging, which tree roots may not like. And long term, it is likely to lead us to issues with stability issues, because the tree roots don't get, or they don't gain the required rooting depth for stability. So cultivation, first and foremost, should try to create a good rooting medium by mixing organic and mineral soils. And improving soil aeration, yes, where possible, but again, the options are limited. If you really want to drain a site, then yeah, fair enough, but there's only so much cultivation can do. Weed competition, rarely necessary, because usually peaty glaze are not that fertile, but there may be exceptions. Again, I've tried to visualize that, showing a normally developed spruce root system. On a peaty glade, what we often find, the roots, they stick to the peat layer because it's quite easy to go there. They find most of the nutrients in the West Coast climate in Britain. It's wet enough so the peat never dries out, and they're therefore reluctant to actually gain any substantial depth in the by growing into the mineral soil. Those two pictures hopefully illustrate that they were actually taken from the same site, but where on the left you can see that the tree roots, they have actually managed to go into the mineral soil, but this was a bit of an iron pan soil patch. So you have over 1 meter rooting depth here. The root plate on the right, that was grown in a peaty glade, and you see exactly what I tried to illustrate. So the sinker roots, they have hardly developed, so they were quite happy to put the toes into the peat layer and never go to any depth. And it is quite obvious why such a tree is a lot less stable. It may perform just as well as the tree on the left, but it is a lot less stable long term. I'm trying to visualize that here. Hinge mounding, you get your rooting medium, a mixture of mineral and organic, but ideally, if you plant your trees in here, they still face this barrier between peat and pure mineral soils later on. And I think it would be far better if the tree had actually only make the transition between a mixed medium and a mineral soil. Right, and finally, Rankers, Rancinas, skeletal soils. I think the picture says it all. By definition, you have less than 30 centimeters of soil to work with, so minimizing disturbance is the overriding principle here. So they should never ever be cultivated. Right, so far. That was the first part of the presentation. I think the plan is to go into a 10-minute break and then maybe have a few questions, but I'll hand over to Chris again.
Well, I think we might as well restart. Hopefully everyone's back. Michael Bruce asked a question on recent research by Stirling Uni and the James Hutton Institute indicating significant loss of soil carbon when native trees are planted on organo-mineral soils on top of any cultivation. Is there always the right tree for the right soil?
Well, is that the question?
Yeah, that's the question. Is there always the right tree for the right soil?
It's not necessarily one, but yes, by and large, there is always at least one right tree. But also, I would also quite clearly say we have to go away from the assumption that we always will be planting one tree species. So we need to boost resilience and versatility and diversity of our forests. So we have to move towards mixtures and more diverse, structurally more diverse forests. So my honest answer would be yes, there will always be a number of tree species which are the right choice for any site.
I did put in the answer that, of course, we don't allow planting on deep peats greater than 50 centimetres. And I would point out, Natural England, their definition of deep peat is 35 centimetres. So even that, at the moment, is open to debate. There was quite a bit of chat on the soil, the FC soil system, Jens. I know it doesn't quite kind of amalgamate the questions. It doesn't quite relate to agricultural sites. We'll try and post a link to, I forget the institute.
James Hutton Institute.
James Hutton, is it? Right, okay. Any general comments on that we can?
Yeah, just very quickly. There are worldwide, there are 2 or 3 very main streams or strands of the way of looking at soil classification. There is 2 big ones, the American system and the European system. And what we apply over here and what many other countries do is actually the European system. So irrespective of whether you're looking at it from a farming, from a general land use, or from a forestry point of view, the European system forms the backbone or the underlying basis for the FC soil classification. So, and the same Scottish Soil Survey, James Hutton Institute, yes, that is part of the very same family. So they may call them a bit differently, but by and large, they will have brown forest soils, which can be, we call them brown earth. You can always draw parallels, and you can find, you can allocate them to one to each other. It's just now forestry has looked a bit into its own specialism. Yeah, we need to come up with something that is specific to forest management, whereas farmers, they have gone with an agricultural system because they have very different needs. They look at very different characteristics, but by and large, they are comparable, certainly the general one and the forestry one. And there was another question here. I'm afraid for forestry, there is only the FC system, and the FC system, it's compatible with the general one, and it's also very compatible with other European systems. So there's absolutely no need and no point to divert from that. So if anyone said, oh, we make our own, well, you'd be reinventing the wheel. So I'm afraid it may be called the FC system, but I see it as the forestry system. It has been developed by forest research for a good reason, and it's compatible to what other countries do. It's compatible to the wider context of soil systems. So that's what we have to work with.
Yeah. A question from Andrew Long. How well can subsoiling and ripping alleviate iron pans or impermeable layers?
Oh, how long? It depends on the nature of the soil. I don't think there is a good answer. If it's, and I'll take, for example, ripping, if you say you rip an iron pan, that is, you do that for a very long time. Soil formation, because if you think about the iron pans in natural soils which we're dealing with, they have formed since the last ice age. This is when all our soils originated from. So that gives you kind of an idea about the time span. So it is definitely, if you rip a soil properly and address an iron pan, I think that you don't need to worry about that site again, nor will your successors in the job. For subsoiling, let's say very heavy clay soils, it may not last quite that long. So but there's absolutely no data available. So.
Okay. And Mike Challoner asks on highly nutrient-rich arable brown soils, how deep can the cultivation go to reduce the subsequent competition of weeds and grasses? That's possibly a policy question as well. Anything to add? Anything to say, Jens? I mean,
I'll come to that in the second part of the guidance. Really is to be very careful with the fertile brown earth, because by cultivating too intensively, you may actually activate a seed bank and you may actually create your own weed competition. So paradox as it may sound, the advice for the fertile brown earth is to be even less intensive with your cultivation.
Okay, and Michael Bruce again has said the question wasn't answered directly about the right tree on the right soil. I think Michael, Jeanette Hall has also posted a question that possibly Jens will try and answer this at the end of the talk about carbon emissions and our plantations net emitters for some period of time. I think that's what you were saying, wasn't it, Jens? You'll try and answer that more towards the end of the talk.
I will, but I struggle a bit with the question, where's the evidence that plantations are net emitters? I mean, they can only be net emitters if it is intensively cultivated. If you just stick a tree in the ground, a growing tree is not an emitter. A decaying tree is a net emitter. So I'm a bit, it says here mixing and mineralizing humus on shallow peat. Yes, but it is actually, it's the cultivation method which makes those stands net emitters. It's not the stand in itself. And that's exactly what we're trying to address. So we will come back to that when we actually look, because we're going to look next at the range of cultivation methods and where we should apply them.
Yeah. Okay, Jens. Howard Price we respond to landscape character assessment to indicate right trees for the right place. Is this a justifiable technique? I mean, Howard, this is a technical session on cultivation, but it has to be taken in context with all the other UKFS requirements, including landscape character assessments. So yes, it is a justifiable technique, but it's also got to be taken into account with soils and cultivation. This is a technical webinar on soils and cultivation. I hope that makes sense. And lastly, and then we'll get back to the webinar. Andrew Heald, thanks for interesting presentation. There are economic trade-offs to consider in cost of ground prep and also in speed of establishment. Will this be discussed later? Not really. Not the economic side, is it, Jens?
I'll allude to it because I would definitely say I would rather discuss that at the end, because we'll go into the decision making. We're only halfway through the decision making process, and obviously there are some snippets in there which actually lead to the economic considerations. And
okay, that's brilliant. I'll keep an eye on the chat and the question and answers. If you can, remember to put on your chat to all panelists and attendees so everyone can see the question. Thank you. I'll pass back to Jens.
Right. Okay, I need to find the share screen again. Right, hopefully you're all back in the presentation, or it's back with you. So far we've had stopped at determining the soil-based objectives for cultivation, and well, hopefully it made kind of sense what I said about what you should aim for on different soil types. The next step is obviously to identify the techniques which will achieve those objectives. So we'll need to have a quick run through the techniques and start with an overview. On afforestation sites, it probably is quite relevant to distinguish between linear and non-linear techniques. Obviously, the linear ones giving you a continuous trace of planting positions, whereas the non-linear ones give you discrete planting positions. And some of the techniques, they have actually options for both. If you think about scarification, subsoiling, ripping can be done linear or non-linear, mulching can be done. It's really plowing is a linear only, mounding and screefing are usually non-linear, but mounding, yeah, is a non-linear one. So just a very quick run through some of the techniques. There will be plenty of video clips which I will comment on and cut short. I'm not going to rate any length, but starting with some of the less intensive techniques. Scarification, it's not a brand new picture, but it shows the principle quite well. You have those rotating wheels. Well, they flip over and they screeve off, they scarify the soil, so they remove the ground vegetation, expose the mineral soil, and they create individual weed-free planting positions. So one of the more forestry machines here, the Bracker Scarifier. I hope it is quite visible here that the wheel or the blades of the wheel, they are not supposed to dig in very deep into the soil. They just rip off the surface vegetation. On a restock site, obviously they can, or sometimes cannot, deal with the brush. So what is important to remember with scarification, the thumbs up scenario on the left is what you're trying to achieve. Expose the mineral soil. This lump should not have much soil. That should be surface vegetation rolled up into a ball. So the green double-ended arrow here with A, that is your planting position. On the right-hand side, that is something different. That is mounding, and we can use very similar machines, and sometimes there's a bit confusion, and sometimes what someone designs as a scarification, the operator turns into a continuous mounding operation. So we need to be clear, if we prescribe scarification, this is what, then we want scarification rather than mounding. Scarification can also be done with excavators. On the picture on the right, it's a climbing excavator, because obviously this is on hillsides. It's a very common technique, but there is no reason why an ordinary excavator cannot scarify using the bucket, provided it has it needs quite a powerful boom because and hydraulic system, because it puts a bit of a strain on the boom, but it is perfectly possible. It takes some time and effort to make the operator do it because it goes against intuition. The screeve shown here is created with the teeth of the bucket, but in a pushing movement rather than a pulling movement, which is what most operators normally do, because that's what excavators do when they dig. And you have the option of manual scarification, obviously small scale, but for some scenarios that might be a good viable option. The linear version is continuous scarification. It does pretty much exactly the same, exposes mineral soil, puts vegetation brush out of the way. You can get a little bit of mixing, but not a lot. The main difference really, you get a continuous trace. You use the disc scarifiers, and again, just a quick look at how they work. I'm sure you're familiar with that. So rotating discs, shoving vegetation and humus layer out of the way and expose the mineral soil. Sorry, I didn't mean. I meant to. But there, what you've seen here in the last little sequence is the fact that you can actually alter the width and the angle and the speed of those rotating discs. And this is where a lot of difference is made by applying good or not so good practice. Ideally, from a tree establishment point of view, you want a wide and shallow scar. Remember, it is still a scarification method. So ideally, you want to set the discs at an angle where they just scratch the surface, move the vegetation and the turf out of the way, and expose the mineral soil so you can plant in it. Very often, in my experience, operators tend to set the discs at a steeper angle, and that leads to a deeper scar and to a bit more outcast, so more soil in here. And the reasons for that are probably twofold. A, operators like it because the steeper angle, it means slightly less strain on the machine. The wider and shallower, or the wider that scar is, the more chances that the disc actually hooks up into rocks, large rocks, stumps. So you decrease the likelihood. And the other one is that ongoing, thought among, or perception amongst people that you want an elevated planting position. Yeah, so basically those line scarifiers or disc scarifiers, they need to really to be used to best effect, and it's not just that you use the machine, it's also how you use it. They can also, the disc scarifiers, they're actually capable, the modern ones, they have computer programs, so you can set the discs to lift in periodic intervals. So you can actually use them as linear and non-linear tools. And a well-managed site would look something like this. Obviously not an afforestation site, but it's easily perceivable that, yeah, if you can do that on an agricultural site with quite the similar effects, probably even a lot easier. Right, moving on to ploughing, very controversially discussed. Before I go into that, what made me think in preparation of these webinars is really we are not very good in defining ploughing. There are several ways out there. We distinguish between deep ploughing and shallow ploughing. And although there is a magical figure of 30 centimeters, it doesn't really describe what the operation does. Neither does the terms like agricultural ploughing, forest ploughing. That's no useful at all. That is the purpose, but it doesn't really say what you're doing. By area coverage, you could differentiate between strip ploughing and complete ploughing, and that is probably the most useful, although it is not, on its own, it may not be precise enough. So the way I see this, I can see these four scenarios. The top two show strip ploughing. It's either deep on the right-hand side or it's shallow on the left-hand side. But basically it means you establish distinct plough strips, which you then use for planting one way or the other. The bottom two pictures show complete plowing, again, shallow or deep. But what you do here is quite different. You create an even area where you say, yeah, you have very shallow ridges and furrows, but basically you have turned the entire ground over, which clearly you don't do in the top scenarios. So before we look into plowing, I think it is quite crucial that we are clear about that we are using the same common terms. And in my experience, that is not what's happening out there. It's usually deep plowing or shallow plowing or forest plowing or agricultural plowing, and sometimes someone throws in helix plowing. And nobody is really, it's left to interpretation what each method actually means. Going quickly through the 4 versions that I have singled out here. Strip plowing really just removes vegetation, exposes mineral soil. So it's clearly a linear technique. And it should be done with a forest plow. And I think the video shows quite nicely what the plow actually does. So not going very deep at all, 15, 20 centimeters at most, no tine attached. You end with a more or less wide weed-free strip, and the vegetation is just flipped over, cut and consolidated so it doesn't fall back into its initial position. So planting position, really it's where the arrow shows. So shallow strip plowing on the right side is a good option, but we need to be clear, you plant on the weed-free position, you don't plant on the upturned vegetation. The picture here shows it can even be done in forest scenarios, where this simply, the plow here has just removed the wavy hairgrass and exposed the mineral soil. So it is a possible alternative to scarification on sandy mineral soils. So I'm not saying it's the best, but it is possible. This is what it not should look like. These are examples where we say, no, they've used a tine, they've plowed on a slope, they've planted the trees. I hope you can see the dead Douglas fir sticking out of those plow ridges. And over here, it was even a peaty glaze. So you can see by the presence of the bare root system of the vegetation, a lot of what was apparently quite peaty soil has simply, disappeared. So strip plowing, we need to be very careful. So not on slopes. Don't use it for microsite drainage. So the moment you say, oh, if I plant up here on the plow furrows, they don't need to be very high, that is the first mistake you've made. So don't plant on the ridge. Strip plowing, really, if it's shallow, it should be done to plant down here. But of course, nobody will plant here if it's on the slope and the soil will be washed away. And if you use a tine, it makes things even worse. So to shallow strip plowing, there is a yes, do, but there's also a don't. Whereas to deep strip plowing, I think it's quite clear that is a thing of the past. For various reasons, we can no longer afford to do that. Carbon dioxide release being the first one, but also we don't really make life for us as foresters any easier long term. So deep strip plowing and planting on the ridge is should clearly be a thing of the past. Now, complete plowing, if it's done shallow, it does a lot of things. I'm not reading through this, but you get ample space where you can establish trees at will. So clearly it makes it very easy to plant trees, and you might even argue, okay, we cultivate one last time on a site that has possibly been plowed every year, possibly even several times. So what's wrong with that if we then leave it in peace? The question is, on sites where you could apply shallow complete plowing, most of the time it won't be necessary. I can imagine very few situations where I think, yes, this is a good way to establish trees. And the same goes for deep complete plowing, which addresses a lot of issues. Mixing, improving soil aeration, it can deal with deep rooting vegetation. There may be the odd case where this is a savanna dominated by Calamagrostis grasses, which root a couple of meters into the ground. How can I get on top of that? But these will be the very rare exception rather than the rule. So the question is, do we really have to do that? So out of the 4 options, deep strip plowing, definitely no. Shallow strip plowing, if it's done correctly in certain situations, and really, I will spell it out, sandy mineral soils. Nothing, a waterlogged site, forget about plowing. This is not the right thing to do. And the complete plowing will hardly be required. I would not say never ever, but it is very, very unlikely that you'll have to do that. Subsoiling and ripping addresses compaction issues. So either hard pan, it can also aerate compacted soils. So it is recommended for afforestation on heavy clay soils, just to increase the number of oxygen at lower soil layers in those heavy clay soils. Done with a subsoiler or wing. As you see, you get hardly any traces of it on the surface. It is really a subsoil technique, and really should be applied if there are either issues with an underlying pan or a very heavy and compacted clay soil. Moving on to mounding. It's it's a kind of multi-purpose method. You can handle brush with that. You can remove vegetation. You expose mineral soil. You can mix mineral soil with humus and litter. You can create a weed-free planting position. It's more or less elevated, depends a bit on what kind of mounding you use. I'd like to comment a bit on maybe not so much in England, but in Scotland, there is a bit of hype around mounding. It's seen as the default solution because the elevated planting position creates a drained microsite, which clearly has positive effects. It also clearly has negative effects. Desiccation, micro-erosion restricting root growth. It has long-lasting effects. I mentioned that study we just did on trench mounding for Forestry and Land Scotland, which quite clearly showed this is not a sustainable technique. There are different types of mounding though, but it's at least questionable whether the benefits you gain from mounding are actually worth the trouble if you consider the possibly negative side effects. There's 3 general ways. Hinge mounding, you create a shallow borrow pit next to the mound. Trench mounding, you borrow your soil from spoil trenches. And inverted mounding, where you fill in the borrow pit with the same material. And obviously you get quite a different, that has different effects on what it does to drainage, what it does to the mixing of the soil, what it does to the micro relief of the site. And comparing the 3, if you compare them by costs, hinge mounding is probably the cheapest and inverted mounding is the most expensive. Trench mounding is probably the neatest one because practice these days, you can hide a lot of harvesting residue in the trenches. On the environmental side of things, it's inverted mounding that scores best because the only way where it doesn't score quite so well, you get a shallower mound. So the kind of your drained microsite is less pronounced than with trench and hinge mounding. But long term, that is actually a good issue. And there are studies out there from Sweden, for example, which clearly indicate inverted mounding increases actually the survival rate of the trees. So there is a trend elsewhere to see that people actually are switching to inverted mounding. Everywhere else, the inverted mounding is the least worrying in terms of what do you do to the site, how much soil do you shift, and even if you say you just on a peaty clay, you mix the organic peat with the mineral soil, you embed it into a mold where it is less likely to dry out quite so quickly, where the nutrient leaching is less pronounced, yet hopefully enough to give the trees the required start-up help. So mounding, again, on training courses, we look much more detailed on the pros and cons. Here, I would it should just suffice to say, yeah, there's more than one type of mounding, and you probably need to look careful what you do, which one you apply. Continuous mounding. This takes us rather close to the patch scarifier. The difference here is, I hope you can see that the wheels are much deeper in the ground, so you bring up a lot more soil from your operations. So unlike scarification, where we really wanted to expose the mineral soil and use that as a planting position, the continuous mounding is actually meant to bring up soil and create a compacted mound, which is used as a planting position. Again, it has pros and cons. It's obviously it's a very quick method, and for afforestation sites, it is far quicker than using an excavator. And it has a lot less of the negative effects of, let's say, double moldboard plowing if it's done in the wrong way. It's not without problems. You may have to deal with the vegetation. Those mounds you create, a good proportion of them is actually made from the surface vegetation. If the vegetation is too tall and too coarse, you're likely to end up with air pockets in those mounds, which are not great for root growth. So you have to consider very carefully, and you may have to mow the site first and say, yeah, if it's very short grass, but if you have rushes on the site and other dead vegetation, very rough vegetation, which is 0.5 meter high, then don't be surprised if your mounds actually are not that well compacted and your trees don't like it in them. Mulching, to look at the next technique, it does quite a lot of things. You can deal with harvesting residue, so you mix the shredded residue with litter, with topsoil. You can do it, can be linear, it can be discrete. So you can either have dedicated machines with proper mulch heads, or you have smaller mulchers which are excavator booms. You also see a bit of the difference between having one pass with the mulcher that's on the right-hand side of the mulch head and two passes. So it's, you have actually quite a bit of, or you can at least choose between two levels of intensity. If you think one pass will do it, then fine. Two passes, there's usually it creates a different quality, because you really, the first pass is usually just shredding the vegetation and brush. The second pass is to work it into the topsoil. So depending on what kind of plant and medium you want to create. So that's the techniques I wanted to briefly cover. What there are more. I'm not aiming for completion here, but out of those, I think the range is pretty much represented. Out of that range, you can now look at what does the job I wanted to do, and at the same time has the lowest overall negative impact. And to help you there, there is some guidance out there. And straight away, well, you see that table here, which looks at expected impact of using different cultivation techniques. I must admit, there is a bit of a danger with using these tables. For a start, you could argue with the facts that line scarification really disturbs a lot more ground than trench mounding. So the figures, I would cast some doubt. I know for a fact that some of them, they don't mirror what I know forest research has shown. More generally, it depends a bit on the tools and the techniques. It depends on the operating depth. Some of that is limited here. So actually, do you scarify to 10 centimeters or do you scarify down to 30 centimeters? How good or how bad is your practice? What kind of soil texture are we looking at? Terrain, particularly linear ones, it makes a lot of a difference if you do it on a slope or in flat terrain. Operations design. So I'll come back to some of these, but there is quite a bit more to that than this rather simplistic table would suggest. And finally, how much carbon you release, it depends on the carbon content of the soil. So how much soil I disturb, well, you can go for 560 cubic meters per hectare on the plow. Well, if it's a sandy brown earth, that may not be such a bad thing. If it's a peaty clay, it's definitely a bad thing. So the same number of soil moved is not necessarily a result in the same number of carbon dioxide released. So on a cultivation guide I developed for Forestry and Land Scotland a couple of years ago, and which hopefully will be rolled out as a forestry research document later this year, I came up with this decision-making matrix. So you've got your carbon content. I've only added that recently. So there's little white to black strips or boxes. They are supposed to simulate how much carbon is in the soil. So obviously not that much in a brown earth, considerably more potentially in a podzol and an iron pan, not much in a clay. Peaty clay could be up to 45 centimeters and definitely quite a bit in deep peat. Then we have the soil moisture regime. So we've got the freely draining brown earth and podzols on top and the waterlogged clays and deep peats at the bottom, iron pans sitting in the middle as a bit of a hybrid. And we have a number of cultivation techniques assorted from the least intensive on the left to the most intensive on the right. Right, if we fill this, and I'm not going to do it line by line, I'll do it by soil group. So brown earth, the key we're using here, 3+ indicate recommended best practice, 2+, yeah, it's an alternative. 1+ maybe on some sites it may be an acceptable alternative, and nothing there, well, don't do. And straight away, no cultivation features quite favorably here, and actually even more so on the fertile soils. The reason is really that if you have a fertile brown earth, cultivation is likely to induce weed growth. So cultivation techniques, which are mostly scarification, so something very superficial where we say, oh, we just need to deal with the weeds on top and expose the mineral soil. On a poor brown earth, that is actually more acceptable than on a fertile brown earth, where we find that the thistles, and very often you find that on afforestation scheme. And I go to the office every time I drive past a scheme where they have done shallow plowing, and actually all the thistles are in the plow furrows and on the plow ridges, and there's the bare grass strips which are in between. It's just the grass sort. So you wonder what you really achieve by stimulating weed growth by intensive cultivation. On podzols, still there will be plenty of sites where no cultivation is a viable option. If you think you have to cultivate, scarification, mulching, but anything superficial. Inverted mounding, I'm not saying it has to happen, but at least you're not doing any harm by doing that if you actually mix the soil layers and create a planting medium which has a bit of all parts in it. With iron pan soils, the ones where you can actually access the pan, the differentiation here is between the benign pans, where the pan is not much of an obstacle to root growth, and the fierce ones, where you say the pan really needs to be addressed, otherwise tree rooting is compromised. The latter one you really need to rip the site. Inverted mounding may do the trick. On an afforestation site, you are likely to go for subsoiling. If it was a restock site, inverted mounding, but there are ripping tools available for restock sites. So you can rip with an excavator, and there are increasingly good ripping tools available now. So potentially, if the pan really gives you a reason for concern, then yes, some subsoiling is required and will be very beneficial. Otherwise, if the pan is not that bad, some of those may be possible on some sites, or flat planting. A lot of iron pans are actually out of reach. So if you look carefully, usually around culverts or in roadside trenches, you may find, yeah, it looks like a deep peat or peaty clay on top, but actually the underlying problem is an iron pan, and usually quite a heavy one, but the pan is buried 1 meter or 2 meters underneath the surface, so you can't get to it. The advice here is quite simple. You have to treat it like whatever it shows as the surface, as a deep peat or peaty clay. Rankers should be no question. No cultivation here. The exception marked here, patch scarification, but that is where the asterisk applies, so manually only, not mechanized. On the clay soils, a bit like brown earth, so no cultivation wherever possible should be the preferred option. Other than that, mounding. If you think, yeah, we'll need to address the waterlogging by at least temporary aeration, then inverted mounding would be the best, but hinge and in some cases trench mounding would be acceptable. Likewise, patch scarification, there are plenty of clays which are fairly benign, the so-called brown clays, where we say, well, that is almost borderline to a brown earth, where we may actually say flat planting if possible, or if there's too much vegetation, then scarification. And finally, peaty glaze. No cultivation is still an option there, but obviously we will be drawn towards mounding. But again, I would refer back to what I said right at the beginning of today. We sometimes just need to step back a bit and ask ourselves whether we are too impatient and a bit too aggressive with and expect too much. It is perfectly possible for trees to be established and grow in a peaty clay. It's only last weekend I did a hill walk on a site which is being rewilded, in inverted commas. So deep peat and peaty glaze all over, and flat planting of birch, hawthorn and oak had been carried out 3 years ago, and the plants were still alive and growing away happily. Not very fast, admittedly, but they were growing. So it quite clearly showed we don't necessarily have to cultivate. If oak can grow away on a peaty clay soil, then certainly Sitka spruce can. But we made to review our expectations and yeah, where would we want to be after 3, after 5, after 10 years? If cultivation is used, it should be mounding, and I would still argue that inverted mounding is for the reason of mixing organic soil with mineral soil, and is still preferable. mainly because it has, not because it has the most short-term benefit, because it has the least long-term negative effects on soil. Right, so that was step 5 in our decision-making process. We go for the technique with the lowest overall negative impact. And in the yellow box now come all the other decision-making, all the other considerations we should take on board. So far, the process has been very soil-driven, but of course, there are other factors which are acknowledged. So there are climatic ones, there are terrain, there are costs, there are economics, there are in some cases availability, machine capability, skills of operators. So there is quite a bit more to look at. Some of these I will cover briefly. The first one is soil texture. I alluded to it several times. Soil texture is very loosely, or rather loosely, linked to the soil type. So it's not always that a clay soil is also a clay soil. And it's not always that a brown earth is a very nice loam. So there is a texture needs to come in at a bit of a separate level. You can summarize those from the soil texture triangle into sandy, clay, and loamy soils, and they all have their different issues. Clay soil compaction is the big issue here, and it is very difficult to repair. So on a clay soil, my first worry would be, what kind of machine do I take on that side and where do I take it? Because the microstructure of the soil particles is very sensitive, very fragile, and it takes very long to recover from deformation. On the plus side, there's not much of an erosion risk on clay soils, but that also means if you create mounds on the clay soil, you live with that mounds for centuries. Sandy soils, to go to the other extreme, erosion is the big factor here. So very prone to erosion, and also sandy soils, much less of water holding capacity, which means much higher drought risk. Loamy soils, somewhere in the middle, erosion is an issue because sand and also silt are easily be washed away by water, and the silt at least will affect the water quality. Compaction, on the other side, is also becoming an issue because loamy soils have a certain amount of clay in them. So we need to tread more careful. I've already addressed, well, one of the left-hand picture I've showed you already, slopes. What matters for slope is really the use of linear techniques, plow lines, linear scarification. Because for obvious reasons, slopes, this is where gravity kicks in, and if you apply worst practice, you can end up with serious erosion issues. My advice would be linear techniques on slopes only along contour lines. So if you think you can plow a side along the contour line, I don't have much of an issue with that. But what we've seen here on the picture is clearly, yeah, goes against all reason. If it's too steep a slope to be worked contour line, it shouldn't be worked with linear techniques at all. Looking a bit at slope risk, there's obviously two factors. So the slope gradient goes in there, how flat to how steep is the slope, and the other one is the texture of the soil. So as I said, clay soils least at risk, sandy gravelly soils most at risk, but it's not a uniform. It depends on how high the risk is, depends also on the gradient. Planting density, spacing pattern, there is particular for linear techniques, there is the potential here to reduce ground disturbance. If we just play a bit of a number game, so 2,500 trees per hectare may be our target density. If we arrange them in a square pattern, 2 by 2 meter spacing, we need And if we said we establish them on plow lines or on scarification lines, 1 line every 2 meters. So we have 50 lines per hectare or per every 100 running meters. If we altered our spacing to a 1.6 by 2.5 meter pattern, which gives us the very same 2,500 planting positions per hectare, we need only 40 plow or scarification lines per hectare. So without even changing the cultivation method, we have reduced disturbance by 20%. And I think afforestation sites offer us all the chances to do that. And the rectangular spacing actually will have further benefits for future operations. If you think about first thinning, you take out a row and you end up with an almost 5 meter gap, which allows machines to pass safely. Here, you only have a 4 meter gap with all the negative consequences of damaging to rack-side trees. So weeding operations, it's much easier to run a small tractor, a quad bike with a mulcher to deal with weeds. You can run them more easily in a 2.5 meter strip than in a 2 meter strip. So there is a bit, sometimes I think we are a bit too hooked up on our square spacing. And I'm not going to integrate details triangular spacing. It's just there for completeness. It is a common method. It actually makes best use of the growing space, but you can think of it square. It's a square spacing turned by 45 degrees. But basically, as a bit of food for thought, that sometimes just changing the spacing actually offers potential to reduce disturbance. And finally, a few words on multiple soil types. I said that was one of the challenges for us. We often have large sites which have more than one soil type, which means we need to look at more than one method to do the right thing in terms of cultivation. And it also requires the operator to react when things change. So very general, multiple soil types, they favor the more versatile machines. So where we normally say a disc scarifier or a continuous mounder, they're very good. They make cultivation cheap and easy. And on afforestation sites, they're quite easy to apply. But their specialization actually, becomes a disadvantage because they can do one thing only. An excavator, potentially, if we use it to our advantage, can do different things. An excavator can screeve, mount, it can manage brush, it could possibly rip. You can mount different tools, different shaped buckets, mulcher, ripping tools, grapples on the same machine. And possibly you can use the same machine to change your technique. And the way I visualize that, if we just thought we look at a site where the overall prescription say, well, it's largely something glayey, so mount. If the operator sitting in his cabin and mounts away, as long as the mounts remain gray, it's mineral soil and there's nothing wrong with mounding. If the mounts turn gray and black, the operator should realize that they've moved on into peaty clay. So ideally, making inverted mounts where we say, yeah, don't establish the mount on top of a peat layer, put it into a bowl where the rooting medium has actually contact or is in direct contact with the underlying mineral soil. If the mounts turn completely black, well, the bucket only get cuts through the peat. So stop mounding and go to the area will have to be flat planted, or if you think that is not feasible because it's too wet, then it needs to be an inverted mount and consolidated at very least to make sure that we don't release too much carbon by establishing holes and a number of protruding mounts in an area which all lead to drying out, to the peat drying out. Tricolor mounts showing a bit of orange and a bit of gray and a bit of black. they are a clear indication we've either moved onto an iron pan soil or on a pot soil. Well, if it's an iron pan and if the option is there, we could switch to ripping. If it's a pot soil, we could either go for flat planting or scarification. For both, we could go for inverted mounding without doing any harm. And obviously, if the mound turns brown, well, why would you mount a brown earth? So switch to screefing, just use the bucket for a different purpose, for a different operation. So that's the kind of site management, the level of site management where we need to get to. And I appreciate that it may not be as easy as I make it sound here, but nevertheless, that should be the target. The conditions are quite simply, we cannot afford to do the wrong kind of cultivation on the wrong kind of site. It's not just bad for the environment, it's also, it doesn't help us with our tree establishment. So that is a bit of a recap, taking on board the things on in the yellow box, and I agree economics will play their role there as well. Resources are limited, but at the end we need to take everything on board in order to come up with a woodland creation plan which not only achieves the maximum benefits for the trees, but does that in a way which is not detrimental for our sustainable use of the natural resources, which are quite essential for our forestry production cycle. So step 6, the woodland creation plan, that would be the conclusion of it all to those of you who actually are in that job roles where we say this is where the decision making has to end, making a good case why or how woodland creation should be done from a cultivation point of view. Right, and so much from me. I think I will stop sharing and we can move on to questions again.
Great, thanks very much, Jens. That's brilliant. Given us quite a bit of time actually for questions. Michael Bruce came back about his question on right tree, right place, etc., about mycorrhiza and mobilizing organic matter. Michael, I'm not sure. I know a man who would probably be able to better answer your questions. If it's okay with you, I'll ask him and perhaps give you an email. We should have your email address as part of the registration process, but perhaps also possibly look at that that guidance note I sent through, understanding the carbon and greenhouse gas balances of forests in Britain. It's quite a read, I think, but good one to look at. Jens, Ben Clinch asked, looking at your proposal to use inverted mounding on iron pan and glaze soils, there may be a need to drain microsites more intensively to improve rooting and secure better rotational and silvicultural thinning options. Therefore, should we be looking for more diffusion pond sites to manage the water and more fully use open ground percentage to hold water in the forest but off the rooting zone?
This is, yes, I wouldn't say, yeah, I would say yes, that is, but I would also say this is just one option to say, well, we probably need to think more detailed about what kind of drainage system we oppose and how we can manage to keep water on the site. The other one is quite clearly tree species selection. If we are certain, well, this site is too wet for Sitka spruce or for Scots pine or whatever we want to plant, well, we can't plant that. And the third one would be manage expectations. What we all know about trees drain a site themselves. So the moment that your forest grows, the water level drops usually, because trees, they are like a pump, they evaporate water, and they also reduce precipitation because they intercept quite a bit. So it is basically a bit of a time lag which we have to overcome. And my argument would also be, do as much as absolutely necessary to get the trees established. But the more they get established, the more they will actually take care of the site, the more the trees themselves will drain the site. And it is a bit a kind of, maybe we have to be a bit more ready for compromise to say how long are we prepared to wait? What kind of yield class do we expect? The other side is, of course, also true. If we accept that a forest regulates the water level, that plays very much in the hand of continuous cover forestry, because that sudden surge of the water table after clearfell, in CCF scenarios, it doesn't happen. So basically you keep your site much drier if you maintain your forest cover. So I would agree with Ben to say, yeah, we could look at options to keep more water in the forest in other ways, but that is one path I would consider and not the only one.
Okay. Rupert Lane, he was wondering if there's a depth that more or less carbon is held in soil. Presumably with a shallow scarification or even a shallow plough, less carbon is released, but do we know by how much?
Well, I think the bad news is most of the carbon is on the surface, and the deeper you go into the soil, the less carbon it is. So yes, in principle, this is right. The more shallow you cultivate, the less carbon you release, but it's not a linear trend. So you can't say if I cultivate the top 50 centimeters compared to I cultivate the top 25 centimeters, the latter will release only half the carbon. It's more likely that the latter will reduce still 80 to 90% of the carbon, without my figures now being correct. But unfortunately, the carbon sits in the organic layer and to some degree in the topsoil of the mineral layer, so in the A horizon. So the deeper you dig, the less carbon you actually find. That is the general truth.
Okay. John Weir posted that when he was doing a lot of cultivation, we left it to consolidate for up to a year before planting. There will be those that say with grant conditions, we do not have the time to wait. What's your view on that? I mean, clearly with scarification, it's not needed, he's put. And Kath McNulty answered, what about weed regrowth if you leave sites for a year?
I can kind of see why foresters, particularly mounds are usually left to consolidate. But again, there's two very different sides of that coin. On the pro side, yes, they consolidate a bit, but at the same time, the moment we have done the cultivation, weed regrowth starts, micro erosion starts, and nutrient leaching starts, and carbon release starts. So basically, from an environmental point of view, it would be much preferable if cultivation was followed immediately by planting, because what cultivation, the moment we mix mineral with organic, this is what starts the breakdown process of the organic. This is what releases the mineral. With no trees there to pick them up, the only thing that will benefit from it are the weeds, and what the weeds can't pick up, a good proportion of that will have leached away by the time we establish the trees. So consolidation of mounds, I think the answer is finding a mounting technique which doesn't need much consolidation, or you may have to consolidate the mounds themselves. But I think we can't afford that. Grants being quite a different option, but even for environmental reasons, I don't think consolidation is something we should do or wait for.
Okay. There's a couple of questions on ex-agricultural sites and plough pans. One from Liam Plummer, and I'm sorry, I can't remember who the other person was on the chat function, but would you treat plough pans on ex-agricultural soils similarly to iron pans? Any other considerations to take into account?
Possibly, yeah. I would, if there was a severe plough pan and I thought that could potentially be an issue for rooting, I would say yes. Of course, I would also, my rationale would also be, it's a site which has been ploughed year after year, otherwise we wouldn't have a plough pan. So if I do it one more time and possibly even plough it deeper and say, yep, okay, I'll have to bite the bullet one more time, but then I can actually leave it in peace. And I'm establishing a crop which can then start accumulating carbon for 50 or 100 or 150 years, and I will never ever plough it again. I'd say if that is beneficial to tree growth, I would do it. But it is, again, the decision whether it is beneficial, it will depend on many factors: the nature of the plant, the pan, the depth of the pan, the rooting habit of the tree species. So there are species which are more robust, to which a plough pan won't mean much, but there are others who actually will really restrict their rooting if they meet a pan.
Okay, we've got an anonymous attendee who said that there is extensive use of continuous mounding in the north to new woodland creation sites. What is your view on this? I mean, I'm guessing it's site-specific, Jens, but...
It is site-specific, and I would also, if I'm quite honest, I'm not a huge fan of any mounding, maybe inverted mounding being the exception. What we do by continuous mounding, we create a very regular pattern of holes and mounds. And we do that, if we do it correctly, we do it on waterlogged sites. So chances are the holes are likely to form puddles, and the mounds, if we are really unlucky, they might dry out. But basically we get trees sitting on little mounds surrounded by puddles. And I don't see that necessarily as a great advantage, and it has repercussions, or it has knock-on effects for future operations. That trench mounding study, we assessed the implications for future mechanized harvesting on those sites, and the outcome was the trenches have a negative effect on 75% of the sites. The mounds and the high stumps had an effect on 84% of the sites. So actually, the mounds and the high stumps resulting from the mounds were the bigger problem for mechanized harvesting later on. So it was, trenches were bad enough, but the mounds were even worse. And we do pretty much exactly the same when we use continuous mounding. So I'm a bit worried about not thinking long-term enough and thinking, yeah, the trees are, we gain 2 yield classes after 20 years, but we lose a lot of time and therefore money when we're actually harvesting the product. So I think there is still, I can see the advantages short-term, but I think long-term it is, there is still quite a big problem attached to that.
Great, thanks, Jens. David Everard, he's asked, you have spoken about straight planting being preferable wherever possible, at least from an environmental point of view. Do you have any thoughts on viability of planting techniques such as pit planting versus slot planting?
Yes, absolutely. And I would have to start from my experience of planting on the continent. There are at least half a dozen, if not a dozen, different planting techniques there, where if you look at the UK practice, most of the sites, it is just notch planting with a spade. I've never ever seen a planter with another tool than a Canadian planting spade or some kind of very simple planting spade in the UK. And quite clearly, to me, there's it doesn't meet ends if we say we treat all the same soils, irrespective of depth, of stoniness, of texture, of tree species. There is a technique suitable for each kind of soil and for each kind of tree species. And I would definitely say pit planting, yeah, absolutely. Research, and it is quite large scale research from Bavaria has shown pit planting is the one technique that carries the least danger of root deformation and therefore jeopardizes or limits root growth the least. Unfortunately, it's also one of the slowest and therefore one of the most expensive techniques, but we can't have it all.
No. Mark Hamilton's asked how and when do you envisage the guidance will be passed on to Scottish Forestry FC staff? Mark, I don't know if that's quite for this forum. I mean, there's various guidance. I know I said earlier we're trying to produce a UKFS document. It's been in the pipeline for about 3 years, and Rupert asked, when's that likely to happen? The truth is, I don't know, but there is a lot of interest around these webinars we're doing from internally in the Forestry Commission. I suspect it won't be too long. I hope it won't. Jens, I don't know if you've got anything else to add really to that.
Well, as I alluded to, the guidance, provisional guidance document has already been issued to Forestry and Land Scotland. It is actually available as a technical development job report, but it is, of course, it should be seen as provisional guidance produced for Forestry and Land Scotland. But you can, theoretically, you can have a PDF tomorrow if you want to. It's not in the most user-friendly format because it is for Forestry and Land Scotland. The hard copy is really, it's in a very nifty special format which allows you to look at several things at once. I have absolutely no idea. I know there's funding there, and I know that I can start working on it straight away, but I can't. There are quite a few hurdles to jump before it actually becomes an official FR document and could be published. So
and we will
I would hope this year, but
yeah, and we'll send around a copy of our England ops note, which is still in draft format but very nearly completed, with the questionnaire. It's obviously only an England document, but I mean the guidance, well, it's obviously relevant to anyone, but okay, what have we got? Somebody asked about ground compaction via cultivation, Jens.
probably not a lot. It is obviously different if you, it depends on machine. On the kind of size and the ground pressure exerted by machines. So it's not the cultivation process itself that causes compaction, it's the passage of machines. So the heavier prime movers you use for your compaction technology, the worse it is. So there's always that issue. And if you think about, so track-based machines probably better than wheel-based machines. Well, then, of course, you also need to consider weight. And, of course, you need to consider compactability of soils. So really on a clayey soil, I think this is much more of an issue. On a sandy soils, it hardly causes any compaction. Compared, you can only compare, it's never a positive thing, but you can only really compare it to harvesting technology, and there obviously, yeah, there's the harvester, but even more so the forwarders. If you think about, yeah, a 20-ton vehicle moving, that is probably the worst. For cultivation, well, what size of tractor, what kind of wheels has it mounted, what kind of tire pressure are you using? I don't think it's nowhere nearly as bad as with harvesting, but it's still, the downside is with cultivation, we tend to go all over the site.
Yeah.
We compact maybe not very much, but everywhere, whereas harvesting tends to stick to certain routes where the compaction is more severe, but it's more concentrated. I'm not aware about any research having been done about how much compaction we actually get, but you can see that by the imprint of the tire pressure. So you only need to walk past the machine, and if you can see the tire profile, and after 2 months it has disappeared, well, you haven't done compaction. The moment you start creating rutting, you're doing lasting compaction. It's plastic soil deformation, and in the worst case, it even becomes liquid soil deformation. So if your roots fill up with water, that should ring all kinds of alarm bells, because then you are doing severe compaction.
Great. Thanks, Jens. I'm aware it's 12:30. I think myself and Jens are happy to stay on, but obviously if people have to go, that's fine. I really hope you found this a useful and a really interesting technical training session. So we'll just carry on for a bit. Jens, Carol Robertson's asked you mentioned a potential research paper from Forestry and Land Scotland on soil cultivation work. I'm not sure what Carol's referring to. That might be the info flip, or it could be the trench mounding. She's asked when it'll be published. And is other guidance on the topic planned in the near future? There is quite a lot of guidance planned, I think, Carol, like in terms of policy, that I can say. Technical guidance, Jens, it's really...
Well, I think you already mentioned it there. There's those 2 documents which are recent ones. Both of them you can have as a PDF in electronic copy. Send me an email and I'll send it back to you. They're not limited in any way. The trench mounding may be an interesting read, but obviously it's not relevant for afforestation sites, well, other than telling you hopefully not to go for trench mounding. The cultivation guidance, as I said, we hope to republish that in a much more user-friendly format at the end of this year, hopefully. So I can't send you that because that is not something that can go in an electronic copy. That needs to be printed, and
the PDF,
but the PDF, which has the same content, it's just not in the same fancy format.
Yeah.
Basically available.
We might be able to send. I can have a word with Claire, who organised all of this, by the way, from the RFS. So thank you, Claire, for that. I might have a word with Claire. She might be able to send round with the questionnaire or a link, if there's a link to it on the FR website. Save you getting tons of emails, Jens, asking for it.
Well, if I were, yeah.
Right, what else have we got? Yeah, quite a bit of interest in pit planting, as you'd imagine. Worth considering. Sorry, there's a side conversation going on about brash removal, but I don't think that's technically for this seminar. Well, there's Jackie has said that ripping, etc., vital that it occurs in the right weather, and it would be really helped if we had longer woodland creation agreements. Yeah, any thoughts on weather in general, Jens? I know it's come up before on our internal webinars, as in when to do the job.
Well, one of the things with regard to weed growth is quite obviously any cultivation should be done in the dormant season, and not necessarily the trees dormant season, the weeds dormant season. That is what experience has shown all over the place. If you cultivate during the spring and summer months when the weed growth is active, then yes, they will respond, because that is in the nature of weeds. They're quick colonizers, so they thrive on the availability of bare ground, and they are very good at being the first to get the foot in. So cultivation generally, weed growth can be considerably removed when if cultivation is done during the dormant season. So that's with regards to, I don't think the weather on the day really matters that much. It may possibly, it may make, well, if you do things wrong, like if the cultivation you do leads to serious erosion, that'll be more obvious and much quicker visible if you do cultivate on a rainy day, because you'll see the water running down your traces straight away. But other than that, I don't think that the weather on the day, at least out of the top of my head, I can't think about a reason why it should have an effect. It's more the season of the year when cultivation should be done.
Okay, Jens, thank you for that. I think we might have exhausted our questions, Jens, which is really good. So I think, unless anyone wants to quickly post a message, I'll thank Jens very much for another brilliant talk, and it is it's a long time to talk for 2.5 hours. And as I say, thank you to Claire at the RFS for organising this, the technological side of it all, and thanks everyone else for attending. We'll send what we can on, including a questionnaire. Anything to add, Jens?
No, just yeah, from my part, thanks for attending and contributing to it with your questions. I think it was enjoyable for me, and I also found the Q&A sessions, yeah, quite refreshing.
Yeah, I did. Excellent questions, actually. Okay, thanks everyone.